Okay, be great to start just with a little bit of background and introduction to Rebalance Earth, what it is you do, yeah, and how long you've been doing it, etc.
Yeah, hi Phil. Yeah, Rob Gardner, CEO and co-founder of Rebalance Earth. Rebalance Earth is a fund manager that invests in nature as infrastructure, which is a pretty new idea. So the idea is we raise money from pension funds like the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, but instead of investing it in buildings like the building behind it, we invest it in nature restoration. And the way that we make money for our investors is that we get companies to pay typically for either the kind of climate change resilience or the biodiversity resilience that nature does. So it's a brand new idea. There are other funds like ours out there. And as I say, success is that we proved that nature is an investable asset class. And I'm sure we'll unpack that over the course of this interview.
Yeah, and you mentioned West Yorkshire there, and I guess one of the reasons we're talking is that you've fairly recently secured this, I think it's a 25 million you call cornerstone commitment from West Yorkshire Pension Fund to the Nature-Based Infrastructure Fund. So, I mean, without giving us any sort of secret, how did that sort of come about? Yeah, how important is that? How did that come about?
Yeah, so actually that's the second investment they've made in us. So last September, they actually invested in us as a business. So September last year, they actually owned 25% of us as a company, which has given us the money to hire our team. So we're now a team of 17 people. We're the largest dedicated nature-based fund manager focused on the British Isles, and we've got experts across finance, technology, as well as science. So we've got Professor Neil Entwistle, who's arguably the UK's leading river restoration expert. And so crucially, they invested in us as a fund manager to make this happen. And then they've also kicked off our fund with this £25 million cornerstone fund, which is critical because it allows us to demonstrate that you can actually invest in sphagnum moss, you can re-wiggle a river, you can invest in an oyster reef, and we can get paid for it and derive a financial return. So it's really important. This is not philanthropic money. Pension funds like West Yorkshire Pension Fund want four things. One, they need a financial rate of return, risk-adjusted return. So this needs to stand up with other investments. Two, they want true diversification from global equity, global bond, global property markets. Three, they want portfolio resilience. So in a way, this acts as a bit of a portfolio hedge to the big systemic risks of climate change and nature loss. And then four, this is a place-based investment. Our fund is entirely focused on the British Isles and the coastal waters that sit around there. So up to 20% of our fund will be invested under the sea. And for West Yorkshire Pension Fund, this is actually about resilient communities as well. How can investing in nature make West Yorkshire more resilient to climate change and nature loss? How can it make Manchester and the surrounding area more resilient to climate change and nature loss? How can it make the British Isles more resilient to climate and nature loss? And so this came about going back 2 years ago. Rebalance Earth is 2 years old next week. A lot of local government pension funds have a very long-term horizon. And of course, they invest for the next year, for the next 3 years, and the next 5 years, the way most retail investors do. But if you think about the membership of a local government pension scheme or a defined contribution scheme, they have to think for 40, 50, 100 years. And once you start to think on those time horizons, there were two big strategic risks that up until now, people haven't really fully downloaded and thought through. And those are climate change and nature loss. And if I can, let me explain why these big pension funds like Norges, like the University Superannuation Scheme, like West Yorkshire Pension Fund, see these as systemic risks. So a couple of facts and figures. The Institute of Actuaries put out a report earlier this year, and they think in the next 25 years, so between now and 2050, there could be a 25% shock to global GDP, to the global economy in the next 25 years. To put that in context, in COVID, the economy fell 11% and bounced back pretty quickly. And in the global financial crisis, which was probably the scariest time this ever happened to anyone alive today, that was only a 6% drop. So that is material risk to your investment portfolio, to your members. Last year, before Christmas, the World Economic Forum and Accenture did a report, and they looked at the fixed assets owned by telecoms firms, water utilities, so roads, railway lines, power lines. And they think that by 2035, so 10 years from now, up to $600 billion of that is going to be at risk every year as a result of kind of climate adaptation, flooding, drought, water quality issues. And then earlier this year, Norges, which is the second largest pension fund on the planet, over $1 trillion, they analyzed their US equity portfolio, their biggest portfolio, and they took the old models that central banks use and go, we think these are underestimating tipping points, cascading risks. And we actually think that between 19 and 27% of our portfolio is at risk in the next 25 years. So when we think about investing in US equities, we think the consequences of climate change and nature loss, unless addressed, could have that. So the so what is, if you're sat on the investment committee, if you're a trustee of these funds, you have a super long-term mindset. You are thinking about these strategic risks to both your investment portfolio and to your members, and say, well, actually, we need to start to invest in resilience. We need to start to protect against that. We can't just assume that the future will be the same as the past. We can't assume that equities will keep going up in value, that our bonds won't default, that our property, our real estate assets will be okay. And so there is an increasing movement of large asset owners to want to invest in climate and nature resilience. And then in the UK specifically, there's a desire to really focus on place-based investments, which means investing locally, and for the purpose of this call means investing in the UK or British Isles, depending on how you want to define it.
Okay, and in terms of the sort of funds profile, I suppose am I right in thinking it's a bit of a UK first in terms of seeing nature as an investable infrastructure at the scale you're doing it? And in terms of the parameters, maybe the second part is you're going to be focusing on rivers and wetlands more than grey infrastructure because you see that as output. Just talk about those sort of two aspects, if that's all right.
Yeah, so I think there's two things: is how nascent is the market, and also is there size and capacity. Look, once you double click into natural capital, there's actually a number of people who've already been investing in sustainable forestry and sustainable agriculture, who've been investing in what's called climate mitigation. Think of that using planting trees to sequester carbon. In the UK, we have a regime called biodiversity net gain, which means all property development requires a sort of biodiversity uplift, which creates demand for these kind of biodiversity uplift credits. So we're not the sort of first player in that market, but if you think of a sort of spectrum of capital with sort of sustainable forestry and sustainable agriculture at one end and sort of carbon credits, we're at the newest end, which is this idea that you get payment for ecosystem services. How do we get a water utility to pay us to reduce drought? How do we get a supermarket or a manufacturer that has a plant to pay for reduced flood risk? How do we get a water utility to pay us for water quality issues? How do we get a global FMCG, a global sort of food company to pay us to restore fish in the North Sea? So it's that aspect that's new. And as I say, that there are a number of other fund managers like Rebalance Earth who believe the way we do that this needs to be a new asset class and we need to move fast. We've specifically focused on the British Isles. So there are others that are focused all over the world. We've taken this very British Isles focus and also this coastal waters, 20% under the sea, because it's actually the seas and the oceans that often get forgotten. And then within that, I suppose our unique insight is that really climate adaptation, which means how do we respond to climate change, is much more about water. So climate mitigation is all about carbon. Net zero is all about carbon. It's either about producing less carbon or sequestering carbon. But if you think about what's happened as the planet has heated up, there is just more energy in the atmosphere and there's more moisture in the atmosphere, which means that we get more extreme rainfall and more intense rainfall, and we get drier spells. So here in the UK, last October was the wettest month on record, and May was the driest month on record. And this is the new baseline. This is not extreme. It's extreme versus the past, but it's not extreme versus the future. And therefore, we need a solution to this problem. And there are gray-based solutions, flood defenses, water storage tanks, or there are green-based solutions, sphagnum moss, oyster reefs. And in many cases, the cost-benefit analysis shows that anywhere between £1 invested in a green-based, nature-based solution is up to £6 to £10 return, except those returns are typically spread across multiple benefits. There's the flood benefit, the water quality benefit, there's a healthcare benefit, there's a biodiversity benefit. And so what hasn't been done before is how do we identify who are all of the beneficiaries if we restore an oyster reef, or if we restore a river, or we restore peatland? And then who pays and how much? How much should you pay, Phil, as a water utility? How much should I pay as Network Rail? How much should the Highways Agency pay? How much should a supermarket pay? And so what's new is our commercial model is about identifying that value and getting paid for it. And when we do that, that makes it an investable asset class. So that's kind of part one. Part two is the scalability. What most people don't realize about the UK is it's the second largest asset owner market on the planet. There's £5 trillion worth of pension fund money, your pension, my pension, your readers and listeners' pensions. And that number is going to double over the next decade. So by 2035, that will be £10 trillion. And so if you think in the UK, we've got a kind of climate adaptation and nature deficit of about £10 billion a year, £100 billion over the next decade, we kind of say, well, what if there was a 2% allocation to nature here in the British Isles? So 2% of 5 trillion is £100 billion. That could be a huge unlock. So for every £100 invested, invest £2 in nature. And so that's what we're trying to position out there. And therefore, the other thing that we need to prove is that can you actually deploy £100 billion? And so again, this is why water, what we talk about, too much flooding, too little drought, and too dirty sort of pollution, is a multi-billion pound opportunity in the UK. If you take United Utilities, the second largest utility in the UK, they've got to spend round numbers, 13-14 billion pounds over the next 25 years, upgrading the Victorian water and sewage system they have to deliver water to Manchester and the surrounding conurbation. What if 20% of that, £2 to £3 billion, was invested in nature-based solutions, sphagnum moss, rewiggling the Irwell, sustainable urban drainage? So it's a grey-green combo. But once you start thinking on a catchment scale, what we talk about from source to sea, so connecting it all up, then we think there's an opportunity to deliver billions of pounds worth of investment. But as I say, we're at the beginning of this journey, and we need to kind of prove the model and then scale the model over time.
Yeah, so in terms of that model, which is, I guess, getting payments for performance of these, how is it that you engage? Because obviously there are already stakeholders that theoretically are responsible for much of the work you've outlined, although also, as you potentially hinted at, they're not doing as much as is required, or in fact, perhaps only a drop in the ocean. So how is it that you get to, do you identify a potential project and then go to the various stakeholders and say, this is what we're planning to do, kind of what's it worth to you, or just how do you engage, I suppose, is be good to understand.
Great question. I think, there are two models. There's a build it and they'll come, let's restore nature and let's find the buyers. We tend to favor the other side, which is a very entrepreneurial focus on what's the demand side, who should pay and why. And so we spend an enormous amount of time thinking about, the water utilities, because there's a water utility somewhere in the UK, always. The major infrastructure providers, so road, railway, telecoms, airports, ports. then all the supermarkets and distribution centers, then all the factories. So when we source deals, we have sort of three sources of project. We have people who come to us and say, hey, Rebalance Earth, we've worked on this project. We need X million pounds. It will generate this many benefits. Typically, they're looking for funding and help with the corporate buyers, because that's part of their DNA that they're lacking. So we've got about 50 of those across the British Isles right now that we're looking at and analyzing and triaging. The second bit is what we call corporate led, where we really think about who has got a major climate or nature dependency. So there's a framework that came out in 2023, which is called TNFD. So it sits alongside TCFD, which is for climate change. TNFD is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which means if you're a company and you sign up to it, you need to really understand what are the impacts of nature loss, what are your dependencies on nature, but what are the opportunities? And so we tend to focus and go, which companies would really benefit from a nature-based intervention in the British Isles? Spend hours researching that. Think of like being like Sherlock Holmes about really understanding the inner workings of this company, what the risks are, how they manifest over the next 10 years. And then work backwards and go, hey, by the way, did you know if we restored this sphagnum moss, if we re-wiggle the river, if we work with farmers, we can unlock a lot of risk or a lot of value for you. And so when we think on the corporate side, we think of a classic 2x2 matrix. We think you either own assets, factories, etc., that can go up in value or down in value, and you make money, revenues, and they can go up or down. And so often it's either about avoided losses, i.e., you've got this much revenue at risk, or did you know that the value of your asset could fall by 25% if it was uninsured? And or we focus and go, actually, if you did this, you could improve the amount of revenues you make, or we could increase the value of your asset. You know, think of the New York skyline, where properties along that skyline are now worth a lot more as a result of that interaction. We know homes in the UK that are in national parks typically have a, let's say, 25% premium to those just outside. Once you think that, then you work backwards and go, what's our portfolio of nature-based solutions that we could implement to solve that problem? And so we're constantly looking at what we call economic value, and then how easy is it to restore nature? And the higher of the ratio between those two, the more investable the project is. And then the third one, and the hardest, is these big catchment level approaches. So, you know, we've got a MOU with Plymouth City Council. We're also doing a huge amount of work with Manchester, so Greater Manchester Council, their combined authority with United Utilities and other players, and going, what would a holistic place-based solution look like to materially reduce risk to our A roads, to our airport, to our railway lines, to our water utility, to reduce pressure on our fire brigade because of wildfires, to reduce pressure on the NHS, to reduce flood risk to social housing? How do we take a holistic catchment approach? So that those are the three levels at which we kind of look at deals. But you can see always there's this sort of trade-off between economic value, who pays and why, and what we call kind of catchment complexity. What are the opportunities to invest in nature, and how much will it cost it to implement it? And so we've built a tool which we call GPAP, but think of it as sort of like Zoopla or Rightmove, that helps us sort of match that identify, evaluate, and then monitor that supply and demand dynamic between the need and then the nature-based opportunities.
Okay, and in terms of the fund and your approach and where it sits within, I mean, clearly there's other ways in which public-private capital helps drive or can drive measurable environmental outcomes. How sort of significant do you think what you're doing has the potential to become within that, through so fairly traditional model that exists at the moment?
Well, look, there is a need right now to move fast. You know, it's 2025, we're 5 years away from 2030, that the problems we've experienced this year, last year, 2023 are only going to get worse: heat waves, drought, flooding. So we need a new model, and that new model requires various stakeholders. Think of it as like pieces of a puzzle to come together. We think we're an important part of that puzzle. Obviously, the private finance, pension fund capital to help make that happen. But government policy, government offtakes are important. And I think there's a lot of parallels and analogies to sort of 20, 25 years ago when we started the renewable market. Like, how do we get this, renewable energy going, be that solar power, onshore wind, offshore wind? And that requires long-term offtake agreements. It requires contracts for difference. You're probably aware that DEFRA, the Environment Agency, have a number of consultations out right now at the time of this recording, middle of July, around carbon markets, around biodiversity net gain, around natural capital markets, and crucially around flooding. And, fortunately, there are other firms like Rebalance Earth. There are other firms who recognize that we need to make this work. So how can we come up with a new way of making this investment bankable? Because once we make it bankable, which is what happened with the renewable market, then it's easy to crowd in equity risk, the riskiest part of financing from sort of pension funds, and then crowd in bank financing, so lending. And that needs to be sort of underpinned by government offtakes, and then commercial offtakes with water utilities, with transport providers, with the big infrastructure providers, and so forth. Once we create that, that is how I think we can develop a £100 billion marketplace here in the UK. And I think the really interesting thing, if you think about Labour's missions, is that they want to invest in financial services, and this is an opportunity to really position the UK as a thought leader in using finance for climate adaptation and nature restoration at scale. You might call it green finance, but I think we've always had a really thriving financial services market here in the UK, and I think there's an opportunity, very mission aligned, to make that happen, and then ultimately just make the British Isles a better place to live, and one that is better adapted to climate change.
Okay, and in terms of that sort of ecosystem, I mean, there are so many. It always seems to be the major problem is there's so many different stakeholders, and they all have their own agendas, and sometimes they maybe are conflicting. So, what, if it's possible, what do you see as your role in terms of bringing those together or making a difference? Because it's a complex ecosystem with lots of players that aren't always as willing. Some are more willing than others. So, what do you think you can help achieve, if you like?
Yeah, so I suppose as CEO of Rebalance Earth, I think I've got 4 strategic stakeholders I need to manage. And I'm not saying, as I say, think of us as a jigsaw piece in a puzzle. So firstly, the bit that I think we're particularly good at is raising money from UK asset owners, local government pension schemes, defined contribution, etc. So that's one. The second is a really commercial focus on getting companies to pay for nature because they want to or need to. So we have a really good origination team led by my colleague Anne Reaney, which engages with all of those companies. Remember that second kind of company-led piece. And again, we won't be the only one. The third is engaging with landowners. None of this will happen unless we can work with the big landowners, National Trust, RSPB, the armed services. There are some people who own large tracts of land, United Utilities, Plymouth City Council. So working with the landowners, the farmers, the farming clusters. And then the fourth is working with government and government agencies. So that is DEFRA, the Department for the Environment, the Environment Agency, which is part of DEFRA, but that also means working with Ofwat, which is the regulator for the water utilities. It means working with the FCA as well as the Department for Work and Pensions. So as a CEO, I try and sort of spend my time across all of those buckets. My team are really focused on the fundraising and the getting companies to pay and the landowners. But then there are other groups. So the Conduit Club has pulled together a group called Reflood that may rename itself. But that is, how do we pull together the insurers, the investors, the big corporates to work together? There are also informal networks of like-minded people. So we work very closely with firms like JBA, who do all the flood modeling for the Environment Agency, in which all the insurance companies work. We've got working groups with the water utilities, and then also at a very place-based, getting traction at a Plymouth City Council level or at a Greater Manchester Combined Authority level. But this won't happen unless we work together. And I think the really interesting thing about the nature-based space here in the UK is it's highly collaborative. I think versus, I've attended multiple COPs. There are many sort of carbon players. I think once you operate at a global level, it's too hard and it's too that. I do think the British Isles is a Goldilocks opportunity. It's not too big, it's not too small, it's complex. And I think the people who live and work here care, and it will only happen with collaboration between government, with clear guidance and clear policy, with clear desire to act from the big infrastructure players, the companies who need this climate resilience and nature resilience, from the pension funds who want to allocate to natural capital. And then there are all of these all the companies that will make this happen, the traditional engineering firms, the Atkins Realises, the Arcadis, the WSPs, the JBAs, the Deloittes of this world, the PwCs. Actually, only by them all coming together can we make this happen. But the good news is that these organizations are coming together, and on the consultations I've mentioned, many of us are kind of replying together with one unified voice.
And maybe just before we finish, in more general terms, I mean, do you think that clearly the folks you're engaging with have sort of understand what's going on and what needs to be done? But do you think overall that the UK has yet to fully, I mean, we tend to think, we get lots of rain, therefore we should never be short of water, although I think there are hosepipe bans out there at the moment. Just do you think overall the UK just hasn't got the message, that these events are going to become more frequent? And I can't remember the stats exactly, but I think by 2050 the amount of water we're going to be short of is it's not insignificant. I can't remember how many wetlands.
Well, London will run out of water. The London Climate Resilience Report that got commissioned last year by Sadiq Khan, well, basically London won't have enough water to function by 2050.
But no one seems to be panicking, is what I'm saying. That's not far away. But we all just seem to be bimbling along, thinking in broad terms that it's not a major issue. So what needs to happen, or how can, as I say, lots of companies may understand, but we need everyone to be on the same sort of page, I guess. Otherwise, it's not so easy. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think people still think that the weather events, the heat wave for the last 2 weeks at Wimbledon, and the flooding in October and at the end of last year, the drought that's happening, and the fact that like our reservoirs are literally dry. People still think of that as an extreme outcome versus a normal, and this is this concept called shifting baseline, rather than accepting that this is the new normal. So if you take the Thames Water annual general meeting or the shareholders update, the CEO says, oh yeah, we were unlucky, precipitation was running at 140% more than average. That is the new average. So the bit that people haven't clocked on is 140% of the past is the new average, and how much worse could it be in the next 10, 15 or 20 years? Look, humans aren't the best at long-term thinking and consequences. It's why we're not very good at saving for our pensions or saving for our future. What we are very good at is reacting to a crisis. I mean, take Texas, right? The good news out of Texas is how quickly people mobilize to save people's lives, to make a difference. So when humans are in real crisis, we really work together to solve stuff, but we act in denial to these sort of long-term shifts. These kind of like what a boiling frog situation. And And I think what's happened is in the past, climate change and nature loss was seen as something that would happen in 2100. It's not my problem. It might be my children's problem. It might be my grandchildren's problem. This will happen in your lifetime, Phil, in my lifetime, in my children's lifetime. The science is undeniable that unfortunately we will hit 2 degrees C by, I don't know, 2037 or 2042, but that is a known known. We know that when there is more, when it goes up by half a degree, there is so much more energy in the atmosphere. And we know that for every 1 degree C increase in temperature, there's a 7% increase in the amount of water in the atmosphere. That's equivalent to 6 inches of water coming the entire planet, extra water. So I say it to people, imagine a washing machine that you've just dialed up the speed and put more water in. You will end up with more intense rainfall, and you will end up with more drought. That is A-level geography and physics. This isn't hard to know. And then what we need to do is go, and what does that mean for my supermarket? What does that mean for our roads and railways? We know that 1 in 4 homes will be flooded, but actually DEFRA have said half our roads and half our railway lines will be flooded by 2050. And if that's going to happen, think about how many substations are going to be flooded. Think about all the knock-on impacts and how this will impact our economy and our lives. So we are at the beginning of that journey, Phil. There are, I would say a handful of corporates, 5 to 10% of corporates who are thinking ahead and planning. We've got a handful of civil servants and all the rest who are thinking about this, but we need to shift that from 5 to 10% to 30 to 50% pretty sharp. And once we get there, then it will become a no-brainer, because this is actually just being totally selfish. This isn't about protecting nature for the sake of protecting nature. This is about protecting our lives, our health, our economy, the things that we all care about.
And I suppose just finally, I have to ask, I mean, are you optimistic that what's required will be achieved, or bearing in mind, I mean, look across the other side of the Atlantic, and some corporates are almost pushing back, or it seems slightly against the whole renewables. It's not necessarily water, but obviously the energy, and the big oil and gas companies. I'm never quite sure how committed they are to the green agenda. But did you worry at all that sort of movement is muddying the waters, if that's like, or do you think that the message that you've outlined, and I think many of us do understand, will sort of overcome any naysayers or doubters?
Look, there is a huge political headwind, anti-ESG, anti-climate that we need to face into. At the end of the day, I think, sadly, we will just get hit by repeated wildfires, at some point. You might not believe in the cause of climate change, but it becomes, I think in the last month, the US has had 4 1 in 1,000 climate-related things. I mean, you can argue about what the cause is or all the rest, but the fact pattern is there are increasing environmental disasters. Are they caused by humans? Are they not? We can argue that all day long, but will it get worse in the next 10 to 25 years? And should we do something about it? I believe that will win through. But, I'm an entrepreneur that, there's 17 people here at Rebalance Earth all quit their jobs to go all in on this. So we kind of live and die by whether this happens. So you're probably asking the wrong person, because we need it to happen. But I'm not optimistic in the short term. For the reasons you've just said, but I am optimistic in the medium term. Let's call that 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I always think cynically that if London flooded, the Thames Barrow failed and London flooded tomorrow, then suddenly it would become very much a top of the agenda. But for as long as it happens in less important parts of the country, etc., it's maybe not an issue. I don't know, but
wait. There will be more and more questions at Prime Minister's question times. There's more. This is already an issue in part. If you have been flooded, chances are, if your home has been flooded, Phil, that there's a 90% chance that you will suffer from anxiety and mental health issues. The UK is highly dependent on SMEs to provide jobs and for the economy. Only 40% of SMEs reopen after they've been flooded. At the moment, these little anecdotes of people who are scared when it rains because their house has been flooded, 7 times in the last 10 years, whose business is closed down. Hopefully in the next 2 or 3 years, this will start to bubble up in Prime Minister's questions time, and this will become an issue, and it will become a non-political issue. So regardless of who's in power in the next, 4 or 5 years, addressing the flooding, the drought, the water quality will become an issue, because politicians care when enough people care. And I think enough people care right now. It's not in the media. It's not in PMQ, but when it does, I think you'll see a big tip and a big shift up the priority list.
Okay, it's been fantastic to chat to you, and some fascinating insights. I mean, to understand what you're doing and your thoughts about, the environment in general. So, Robert, sorry, I really appreciate the time you've given me. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thanks again.